Games are always nicer when people play fair, but let's talk through some specific examples of cheating in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing something a little bit different, talking about cheating in Warhammer 40K, and maybe some of the most common ways in which people might do so, a combination of things that I've seen and heard about. First up, I would say that deliberate cheating really isn't common in my experience whatsoever. I think the vast majority of people are adults who realise that they're playing a game of toy soldiers at the end of the day, and it's quite a sad state of affairs if you feel the need to alter dice or make stuff up to try and give you better chances of winning. I feel that cheating is maybe a little bit less common in 40k these days, maybe with the player base as a whole maybe growing up and aging a bit, but as with any game it certainly hasn't gone away completely. In my experience, and at least what I hear anecdotally on the channel in comments and things, I don't think that cheating is massively more common either in casual or competitive play. Certainly it does seem to be a concern for a lot of people if they go to tournaments. Are they just going to run into loads of tryhards, trying to game for advantage, things that they shouldn't be able to do? But attending quite a lot of tournaments myself, I do find that that's very rarely the case. You might have the odd difficult game, but I'm just not convinced that the average experience is any worse than with random pickup games with people in a local store. But a lot of the worst examples that I've heard anecdotally might be some strange person hanging around a gaming store and starting up a game with someone who's quite new to the hobby, someone who isn't going to catch them when they are trying to cheat. Again, I really don't think that that's representative of the 40k community, but it is a common story that I've heard quite a bit. In any case, I think it is kind of useful to be able to recognise the various ways that you can cheat in 40k, maybe making it a bit easier to challenge difficult players, and hopefully help keep the community positive and games fair and fun. In any case, let's get into it, and let's go through 7 specific examples. First up, you certainly can make errors when moving models. Quite a common mistake among new players is measuring from the front of the base to the back of the base. Say with the Space Marine Gladiator tank, we've moved it 10 inches, or we've managed to gain the entire width of the model's base, which is several inches extra movement. In a game where threat ranges are really important, that can be quite a big deal. Perhaps more than that though, are players who are just a bit sloppy with their movement, measuring imprecisely, often gaining an extra 1 or 2 inches each time they move something. If it's only small errors, it can feel quite picky to challenge something like this, as often it won't be intentional or it might just be plausibly deniable, but if it keeps on happening as they're moving, it probably is going to be worth piping up. If it makes the difference between them making a key charge or getting onto an objective, it's going to have an impact on the game. You also might get people being just slightly optimistic with their measuring. I think people when they play games are biased to want their own things to succeed, and maybe a bit less perceptive of some of the rules that might stop them from doing an action that they think is cool. I think that can often come off in the movement phase, where you think that you can get a model somewhere that it can't quite, maybe forgetting rules like the 1-inch exclusion zone around enemy models that you can't pass within, or maybe not moving quite far enough to get the entire model round the terrain. If say you have a vehicle that's just one side of a wall, it can actually be a whole ton of movement to get it all the way around the wall and back again to the other side, as you basically need to make sure that you get the back of the base to the edge of the wall before you move round it. I think very few people will be too averse to a gentle reminder if their model can't quite make that move distance, and would usually be happy to remeasure if it's an honest mistake. Of course, if the person is deliberately cheating, very occasionally you might get them moving models when they shouldn't be moved at all on the table. There was an example of a high-profile tournament case where someone was caught on live stream casually nudging their hammerhead tank forward with a water bottle, gaining extra movement and not remembering that they were on camera. Obviously that just is blatant hard cheating. Moving on, we have slow play. This is more of an issue if you're playing some sort of event, maybe a tournament or campaign event where the rounds are say 3 hours long. The idea behind this is that say if the player thinks they might well lose by turn 5, but they think they can put themselves at a definite advantage by turn 2 or 3, they could just play super slow, so that the game has to end turn 3 for example, and their opponent just doesn't have the turns to do what they need to do in order to win the game. I think this was perhaps more of a problem in 8th edition, where particular endgame objectives were really important, perhaps more so than 9th. Classically you could have someone with a massive horde army, usually not very good at damaging the enemy but quite good at surviving on objectives for a turn or 2, and of course they just naturally take a long time to play with. If you just slowly move all of your hordes and hordes of boys onto the central objectives, if you don't give your opponent enough time to clear them out, then in theory you might win by default. In general though, I do feel that this is less of a problem in 9th edition. The scoring happens as it goes along through the game, and in general you are expected to finish games on time. A lot of the biggest events advise the use of chess clocks to keep track of time as a result. Then it shows if one player is just being massively more time wasting than the other. I also think that because slow play is just such an obvious thing these days that a lot of people are aware of, you're far more likely to attract attention for it if you're clearly not finishing your games on time and giving yourself advantages as a result. Next up, we come to the dice rolls themselves, and perhaps the most cardinal sin of all is if you turn up with weighted dice. It just defeats the whole point of it being a chance game, and clearly shows out that you've set out to cheat from the very start. It hasn't just been a spur of the moment thing. To my knowledge, I've never played against a person who has been using weighted dice, though I admit it might sometimes be hard to tell. The times where people get caught often just tend to be if they suspiciously keep on rolling incredibly high consistently over the course of the game, or if they just happen to have a special weird looking dice or different set of dice that they suddenly start using whenever there's an important roll going, and seem to do very well whenever they try one like that. Otherwise though, even if the dice are perfectly normal, and some people do seem to enjoy a little bit of dice sleight of hand, things like picking up one more dice than you hit with, particularly things like that are made easier if you roll dice behind terrain, or if you pick them up in such a way that your opponent can't see all the results. That's one of the reasons it's good dice etiquette to roll them in full view of your opponent, so they can see the number of hits and wounds that you've got. Otherwise, it is important to declare what you're rolling first, so you can't claim that a bad roll was just for a very bad gun that your model had, and a good one was for the really good gun. Or maybe being selective with re-rolling Cox dice, where the dice doesn't lie exactly flat. Some people prefer to roll everything that isn't exactly flat, some people only if the result isn't clear. I don't think it really matters which, just provided you do either one or the other consistently, and just don't pick and choose depending on how much you like the dice roll. Next up, another area that's often difficult to be too sure of, are exactly how the rules interact in the other player's codex. 40k has an absolute ton of rule bloat. Codexes are pretty dense these days, with tons and tons of datasheets, all slightly different to how they were in the previous one, a whole bunch of special rules, a lot of stratagems that just don't see play very often whatsoever, never mind getting into things like relics, psychic powers, warlord traits, and more. I genuinely think it's quite rare for two average players to get through an entire game of 40k with neither player making any sort of error or misplay at all, just because there's so much to remember, and sometimes rules interactions aren't particularly obvious. For that reason, I think it's usually good to be understanding if the opponent makes a mistake or two, as most rule errors like this, even if they're in their own favour, are not normally going to be deliberate. The downside to this though is that as a result, it could be an area that's kind of prone to soft cheating, where one player just gets a rule very slightly wrong in their favour, maybe doesn't remember an important downside of a rule, or that it specifically doesn't interact with one other thing in their codex. I think in particular stratagems and obscure rules are quite big areas for this. Say stating a stratagem is slightly more powerful than it is, or it costs one command point less than it really does. If you do that consistently over the course of the game and the opponent doesn't know the army and doesn't challenge it, you are going to gain advantages. As I said, the vast majority of those mistakes I don't think are deliberate, but I think it's perhaps a bit more telling if the other player makes lots of errors within the same game that all favour them, as if every error is in their own favour, it's perhaps a bit less likely that it's a genuine mistake. Perhaps the best defense against this is just knowledge of the key stratagems and most likely plays in other people's armies. But if you're not familiar with the force, I wouldn't be afraid to politely ask to check rules that seem a little bit unlikely, particularly if you vaguely remember a reason that they can't be played that way. Maybe a bit less common and kind of easy to spot in retrospect is if you turn up with an army list that's got more points and more models in than your opponent. That's obviously going to give you an advantage. Perhaps a bit more of a problem for more casual games, one where your army list probably isn't going to be checked any more than a quick glance over by an opponent. I think most people aren't going to get out their phone's calculator and tot up the points cost of every single unit in your army to check whether or not it's right. If it's done to any great extent, it can be pretty obvious. If you can add up your opponent's units and realise it comes to at least 2,500 points, then you've probably taken things over the odds for a 2k point game. But it might be harder to spot if someone just came out with an extra small unit or two. I have heard of that happening occasionally at tournaments, though I'm not too surprised that the person gets noticed and talked about, as that usually requires you submitting a list, and it's really obvious if you're using units that didn't feature on said list. Otherwise, in a similar sort of vein, not having your models vaguely WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, can also be unhelpful and potentially misleading. If you are proxying anything in a more casual game, I think usually the onus is on you to make sure that your opponent knows what that thing is, remind them if necessary, and just make sure they're not making any misplays because they think your squad is armed with something else. Talking of modelling for advantage is another potential area, maybe a bit more of a theoretical one these days, as a lot more people are wise to what it is, and generally accept that at least rules-wise, models should be on the right size basis. and they should have the same sort of profile as models that are assembled by a normal person. For bases being on the wrong side, sometimes it can be an advantage or a disadvantage, and the vast majority of the time I think it won't be any sort of deliberate, willful attempts to gain advantage in rules. Say for example, if you've got some old miniatures that are mounted on smaller bases than the current Games Workshop offering, or if you have a particularly dramatic and epically sculpted character who's got a bigger base than normal to better accommodate any diorama or scenery on the base. I honestly think that most of the time it's not going to make too much difference. I'm just trying to have it in the back of your mind that you shouldn't be gaining any advantages because of the way that you've modelled it. For example, putting a captain on a bigger base shouldn't give you a bigger aura than it would be normally. And if you do have squads mounted on bigger bases or smaller bases than they should be, you just need to make sure that you're not gaining any sort of rules advantage from it, say not being able to fit more models in combat than you should, or hide in a ruin that your unit would be too big to fit in if they had the right sized bases. Maybe the other side of theoretical modelling for advantage might be if you made any changes that drastically alter the unit profile of the model, say how tall it is or how bulky it is, to either make it easier or harder to see. Some particularly silly examples might be modelling something like a Wraith Knight lying down or something I remember seeing a picture of on the internet ages back. That way it could hide behind terrain a little bit better. That sort of stuff is pretty blatant and not really tolerated, though often purely aesthetic conversions might well change the unit's profile. But I think the most important thing in that case is again just to make sure that you're not gaining any advantage from the aesthetics. Often people will have a point on their model where they say it shouldn't be any taller than this. Please measure all line of sights to that part of the model. Again, I think the onus is just on you to communicate well, as with WYSIWYG things. Make sure your opponent is on the same page as you, and just make sure that you're not gaining an advantage by the cool way that you've put your miniature together. Finally, and certainly one to look out for when you're scoring up games, is miscounting points and objectives. Basically when it comes to totting up scores at the end of the game, just making a crucial mistake or two, that might well just be enough to turn a loss into a win. I guess if you're going to cheat on any one thing, then adding up the final scores might be the single easiest way to make that happen. So particularly if you think you're playing someone a bit dodgy at a tournament, it's extra important to keep track of the scores yourself as well, at least if you do want to make sure that you're not in danger of this, and the final result is important to you. I've certainly had a couple of games in my experience where I think that people have done this deliberately, but again, like a fair few of the things on this list, I wouldn't be too quick to jump to conclusions. There's a lot of scoring that goes on in 9th edition missions. It's perfectly possible for people to make honest mistakes. So I think we'll leave that there for this video. Hopefully at least some of that was interesting, and please let me know if you've seen any of this in the comments below, or if there's any other examples that I should have included. I'll look forward to having a read through later. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like it, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep these regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit, I would just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. All these videos do take a fair amount of time and effort to make, so if you're enjoying regularly, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.